Investigation I. Expression and meaning. Chapter I. Essential distinctions. I. An ambiguity in the term sign. The terms expression and sign are often treated as synonyms, but it will not be amiss to point out that they do not always coincide in application in common usage. Every sign is a sign for something, but not every sign has meaning, a sense that the sign expresses. In many cases it is not even true that a sign stands for that of which we may say it is a sign. And even where this can be said, one has to observe that standing for will not count as the meaning which characterizes the expression. For signs in the sense of indications, notes, marks etc., do not express anything, unless they happen to fulfill a significant as well as an indicative function. If, as one unwillingly does, one limits oneself to expressions employed in living discourse, the notion of an indication seems to apply more widely than that of an expression, but this does not mean that its content is the genus of which an expression is the species. To mean is not a particular way of being a sign in the sense of indicating something. It has a narrow application only because meaning, in communicative speech, is always bound up with such an indicative relation, and this in its turn leads to a wider concept, since meaning is also capable of occurring without such a connection. Expressions function meaningfully even in isolated mental life, where they no longer serve to indicate anything. The two notions of sign do not therefore really stand in the relation of more extensive genus to narrower species. The whole matter requires more thorough discussion. To the essence of indication of the two concepts connected with the word sign, we shall first deal with that of an indication. The relation that here obtains we shall call the indicative relation. In this sense a brand is the sign of a slave, a flag the sign of a nation. Here all marks belong, as characteristic qualities suited to help us in recognizing the objects to which they attach. But the concept of an indication extends more widely than that of a mark. We say the Martian canals are signs of the existence of intelligent beings on Mars, that fossil vertebrae are signs of the existence of pre-Diluvian animals etc. Signs to aid memory, such as the much-used knot in a handkerchief, memorials etc., also have their place here. If suitable things, events or their properties are deliberately produced to serve as such indications, one calls them signs whether they exercise this function or not. Only in the case of indications deliberately and artificially brought about, does one speak of standing for, and that both in respect of the action which produces the marking, the branding or chalking etc., and in the sense of the indication itself, i.e. taken in its relation to the object it stands for or that it is to signify. These distinctions and others like them do not deprive the concept of indication of its essential unity. A thing is only properly an indication if and where it in fact serves to indicate something to some thinking being. If we wish to seize the pervasively common element here present we must refer back to such cases of live functioning. In these we discover as a common circumstance the fact that certain objects or states of affairs of whose reality someone has actual knowledge indicate to him the reality of certain other objects or states of affairs, in the sense that his belief in the reality of the one is experienced, though not at all evidently, as motivating a belief or surmise in the reality of the other. This relation of motivation represents a descriptive unity among our acts of judgment in which indicating and indicated states of affairs become constituted for the thinker. This descriptive unity is not to be conceived as a mere form quality founded upon our acts of judgment, for it is in their unity that the essence of indication lies. More lucidly put, the motivational unity of our acts of judgment has itself the character of a unity of judgment, before it as a whole an objective correlate, a unitary state of affairs, arrays itself, is meant in such a judgment, appears to be in and for that judgment. Plainly such a state of affairs amounts to just this, that certain things may or must exist, since other things have been given. This since, taken as expressing an objective connection, is the objective correlate of motivation taken as a descriptively peculiar way of compassing acts of judgment into a single act of judgment. 2 senses of demonstration, indication and proof. We have sketched the phenomenological situation so generally that what we have said applies as much to the demonstration of genuine inference and proof, as to the demonstration of indication. These two notions should, however, be kept apart. Their distinctness has already been suggested by our stress on the lack of insight in indications. In cases where the existence of one state of affairs is evidently inferred from that of another, we do not in fact speak of the latter as an indication or sign of the former, and, essential distinctions 185 conversely, we only speak of demonstration in the strict logical sense in the case of an inference which is or could be informed by insight. Much, no doubt, that is propounded as demonstrative or, in the simplest case, as syllogistically cogent, is devoid of insight and may even be false. But to propound it is at least to make the claim that a relation of consequence could be seen to hold. This is bound up with the fact that there is an objective syllogism or proof, or an objective relationship between ground and consequent, which corresponds to our subjective acts of inferring and proving. These ideal unities are not the experiences of judging in question, but their ideal contents, the propositions they involve. The premises prove the conclusion no matter who may affirm the premises and the conclusion, or the unity that both form. An ideal rule is here revealed which extends its sway beyond the judgments here and now united by motivation. In suprempirical generality it comprehends as such all judgments having a like content, all judgments, even, having a like form. Such regularity makes itself subjectively known to us when we conduct proofs with insight, while the precise rule is made known to us through ideative reflection on the contents of the judgments experienced together in the actual context of motivation, in the actual inference and proof. These contents are the propositions involved. In the case of an indication there is no question of all this. Here insight and, to put the matter objectively, knowledge regarding the ideal connections among the contents of the judgments concerned, is quite excluded. When one says that the state of affairs A indicates the state of affairs B, that the existence of the one points to that of the other, one may confidently be expecting to find B true, but one's mode of speech implies no objectively necessary connections between A and B, nothing into which one could have insight. The contents of one's judgments are not here related as premises are to a conclusion. At times no doubt we do speak of indications even in cases where there is an objective relation of entailment, a mediate one, in fact. A mathematician may make use, so he says, of the fact that an algebraic equation is of uneven order as a sign that it has at least one real root. To be more exact, we are here only concerned with the possibility that someone who fails to carry out and see the cogency of the relevant thought chain, may make use of a statement about an equation's uneven order as an immediate, blind motive for asserting the equation to have some necessarily connected property which he needs for his mathematical purposes. In such situations, where certain states of affairs readily serve to indicate others which are, in themselves, their consequences, they do not function in thought as logical grounds of the latter, but work through connections which previous actual demonstration, or blind learning on authority, has established among our convictions, whether as actual mental states or as dispositions for such. Nothing is of course altered in all this by the possible presence of an accompanying merely habitual knowledge of an objectively present rational connection. If an indication, or the connection of motivation in which such a soi-distant objective relation makes its appearance, is without essential relation to a necessary connection, the question arises whether it may not claim to be essentially related to a connection of probability. Where one thing indicates another, where belief in the one's existence furnishes one with an empirical motive or ground, not necessary but contingent, for belief in the existence of the other, must the motivating belief not furnish a ground of probability for the belief it motivates? This is not the place for a close discussion of this pressing question. We need only observe that the question may correctly be answered in the affirmative insofar as such empirical motivations all fall under an ideal jurisdiction in virtue of which they may be spoken of as justified or unjustified, or, objectively expressed, in which they may be spoken of as real, i.e. valid, motivations which lead to a probability or perhaps to an empirical certainty, or per contra, as merely apparent, i.e. invalid, motivations, which do not lead to such a probability. One may, for example, cite the controversy as to whether volcanic phenomena do or do not indicate that the Earth's interior is molten, and so on. One thing is sure, that to talk of an indication is not to presuppose a definite relation to considerations of probability. Usually such talk relates not to mere surmises but to assured judgments. The ideal jurisdiction to which we have here accorded authority must first demand, therefore, that we should scale down our confident judgments to modest surmises. I shall here observe, further, that we cannot avoid talking about motivation in a general sense which covers strict demonstration as much as empirical indication. Here in fact we have a quite undeniable phenomenological affinity, obvious enough to register itself in ordinary discourse. We commonly speak of reasoning and inference, not merely in the sense of logic, but in a sense connected with empirical indications. This affinity plainly extends more widely, it covers the field of emotional, and, in particular, of volitional phenomena, to which talk of motives was at first alone confined. Here too because has a part to play, covering as wide a linguistic territory as does the most general sense of motivation. I cannot therefore approve of Maynard's censure of Brentano's terminology, which I have here adopted. 1. But I entirely agree with him that in perceiving something as motivated we are not at all perceiving it as caused. 4. Digression on the origin of indication in association. The mental facts in which the notion of indication has its origin, i.e. in which it can be abstractively apprehended, belong to the wider group of facts which fall under the historical rubric of the association of ideas. Under this rubric we do not merely have those facts which concern the accompaniment and reactivation of ideas stated in the laws of association, but the further facts in which association operates creatively, and produces essential distinctions. 187 Peculiar descriptive characters and forms of unity. 2. Association does not merely restore contents to consciousness, and then leave it to them to combine with the contents there present, as the essence or generic nature of either may necessarily prescribe. It cannot indeed disturb such unified patterns as depend solely on our mental contents, for example the unity of visual contents in the visual field. But it can create additional phenomenological characters and unities which do not have their necessary, law-determined ground in the experienced contents themselves, nor in the generic forms of their abstract aspects. 3. If a summons be into consciousness, we are not merely simultaneously or successively conscious of both A and B, but we usually feel their connection forcing itself upon us, a connection in which the one points to the other and seems to belong to it. To turn mere coexistence into mutual pertinence, or, more precisely, to build cases of the former into intentional unities of things which seem mutually pertinent, is the constant result of associative functioning. All unity of experience, all empirical unity, whether of a thing, an event or of the order and relation of things, becomes a phenomenal unity through the felt mutual belongingness of the sides and parts that can be made to stand out as units in the apparent object before us. That one thing points to another, in definite arrangement and connection, is itself apparent to us. The single item itself, in these various forward and backward references, is no mere experienced content, but an apparent object, or part, property etc., of the same, that appears only in so far as experience, erfahrung, endows contents with a new phenomenological character, so that they no longer count separately, but help to present an object different from themselves. In this field of facts the fact of indication also has its place, in virtue whereof an object or state of affairs not merely recalls another, and so points to it, but also provides evidence for the latter, fosters the presumption that it likewise exists, and makes us immediately feel this in the manner described above. 5. Expressions as meaningful signs. Setting aside of a sense of expression not relevant for our purpose from indicative signs we distinguish meaningful signs, i.e. expressions. We thereby employ the term expression restrictively, we exclude much that ordinary speech would call an expression from its range of application. There are other cases in which we have thus to do violence to usage, where concepts for which only ambiguous terms exist call for a fixed terminology. We shall lay down, for provisional intelligibility, that each instance or part of speech, as also each sign that is essentially of the same sort, shall count as an expression, whether or not such speech is actually uttered, or addressed with communicative intent to any persons or not. Such a definition excludes facial expression and the various gestures which involuntarily accompany speech without communicative intent, or those in which a man's mental states achieve understandable expression for his environment, without the added help of speech. Such utterances are not expressions in the sense in which a case of speech is an expression. They are not phenomenally one with the experiences made manifest in them in the consciousness of the man who manifests them, as is the case with speech. In such manifestations one man communicates nothing to another. Their utterance involves no intent to put certain thoughts on record expressively, whether for the man himself, in his solitary state, or for others. Such expressions, in short, have properly speaking, no meaning. It is not to the point that another person may interpret our involuntary manifestations, for example our expressive movements, and that he may thereby become deeply acquainted with our inner thoughts and emotions. They mean something to him insofar as he interprets them, but even for him they are without meaning in the special sense in which verbal signs have meaning, they only mean in the sense of indicating. In the treatment which follows these distinctions must be raised to complete conceptual clarity. 6 questions as to the phenomenological and intentional distinctions which pertain to expressions. As such it is usual to distinguish 2 things in regard to every expression. 1. The expression physically regarded, the sensible sign, the articulate sound complex, the written sign on paper etc. 2. A certain sequence of mental states, associatively linked with the expression, which make it be the expression of something. These mental states are generally called the sense or the meaning of the expression, this being taken to be in accord with what these words ordinarily mean. But we shall see this notion to be mistaken, and that a mere distinction between physical signs and sense-giving experiences is by no means enough, and not at all enough for logical purposes. The points here made have long been observed in the special case of names. We distinguish, in the case of each name, between what it shows forth, i.e. mental states, and what it means. And again between what it means, the sense or content of its naming presentation, and what it names, the object of that presentation. We shall need similar distinctions in the case of all expression, and shall have to explore their nature precisely. Such distinctions have led to our distinction between the notions of expression and indication, which is not in conflict with the fact that an expression in living speech also functions as an indication, a point soon to come up for discussion. To these distinctions other important ones will be added which will concern the relations between meaning and the intuition which illustrates meaning and on occasion renders it evident. Only by paying heed to these relations, can the concept of meaning be clearly delimited, and can the essential distinctions 189 fundamental opposition between the symbolic and the epistemological function of meanings be worked out. 7 expressions as they function in communication. Expressions were originally framed to fulfill a communicative function. Let us, accordingly, first study expressions in this function, so that we may be able to work out their essential logical distinctions. The articulate sound complex, the written sign etc., first becomes a spoken word or communicative bit of speech when a speaker produces it with the intention of expressing himself about something through its means. He must endow it with a sense in certain acts of mind, a sense he desires to share with his auditors. Such sharing becomes a possibility if the auditor also understands the speaker's intention. He does this inasmuch as he takes the speaker to be a person, who is not merely uttering sounds but speaking to him, who is accompanying those sounds with certain sense-giving acts, which the sounds reveal to the hearer, or whose sense they seek to communicate to him. What first makes mental commerce possible, and turns connected speech into discourse, lies in the correlation among the corresponding physical and mental experiences of communicating persons which is affected by the physical side of speech. Speaking and hearing, intimation of mental states through speaking and reception thereof in hearing, are mutually correlated. If one surveys these interconnections, one sees at once that all expressions in communicative speech function as indications. They serve the hearer as signs of the thoughts of the speaker, i.e. of his sense-giving inner experiences, as well as of the other inner experiences which are part of his communicative intention. This function of verbal expressions we shall call their intimating function. The content of such intimation consists in the inner experiences intimated. The sense of the predicate intimated can be understood more narrowly or more widely. The narrower sense we may restrict to acts which impart sense, while the wider sense will cover all acts that a hearer may introject into a speaker on the basis of what he says, possibly because he tells us of such acts. If, for example, we state a wish, our judgment concerning that wish is what we intimate in the narrower sense of the word, whereas the wish itself is intimated in the wider sense. The same holds of an ordinary statement of perception, which the hearer forthwith takes to belong to some actual perception. The act of perception is there intimated in the wider sense, the judgment built upon it in the narrower sense. We at once see that ordinary speech permits us to call an experience which is intimated an experience which is expressed. To understand an intimation is not to have conceptual knowledge of it, not to judge in the sense of asserting anything about it. It consists simply in the fact that the hearer intuitively takes the speaker to be a person who is expressing this or that, or as we certainly can say, perceives him as such. When I listen to someone, I perceive him as a speaker, I hear him recounting, demonstrating, doubting, wishing etc. The hearer perceives the intimation in the same sense in which he perceives the intimating person, even though the mental phenomena which make him a person cannot fall, for what they are, in the intuitive grasp of another. Common speech credits us with percepts even of other people's inner experiences, we see their anger, their pain etc. Such talk is quite correct, as long as, for example, we allow outward bodily things likewise to count as perceived, and as long as, in general, the notion of perception is not restricted to the adequate, the strictly intuitive percept. If the essential mark of perception lies in the intuitive persuasion that a thing or event is itself before us for our grasping, such a persuasion is possible, and in the main mass of cases actual, without verbalized, conceptual apprehension, then the receipt of such an intimation is the mere perceiving of it. The essential distinction just touched on is of course present here. The hearer perceives the speaker as manifesting certain inner experiences, and to that extent he also perceives these experiences themselves. He does not, however, himself experience them, he has not an inner but an outer percept of them. Here we have the big difference between the real grasp of what is inadequate intuition, and the putative grasp of what is on a basis of inadequate, though intuitive, presentation. In the former case we have to do with an experienced, in the latter case with a presumed being, to which no truth corresponds at all. Mutual understanding demands a certain correlation among the mental acts mutually unfolded in intimation and in the receipt of such intimation, but not at all their exact resemblance. 8 expressions in solitary life. So far we have considered expressions as used in communication, which last depends essentially on the fact that they operate indicatively. But expressions also play a great part in uncommunicated, interior mental life. This change in function plainly has nothing to do with whatever makes an expression an expression. Expressions continue to have meanings as they had before, and the same meanings as in dialogue. A word only ceases to be a word when our interest stops at its sensory contour, when it becomes a mere sound pattern. But when we live in the understanding of a word, it expresses something and the same thing, whether we address it to anyone or not. It seems clear, therefore, that an expression's meaning, and whatever else pertains to it essentially, cannot coincide with its feats of intimation. Or shall we say that, even in solitary mental life, one still uses expressions to intimate something, though not to a second person? Shall one say that in soliloquy one speaks to oneself, and employs words as signs, i.e. as indications, of one's own inner experiences? I cannot think such a view acceptable. Words function as signs here as they do everywhere else, everywhere they can be said to point to something. But if we reflect on the relation of essential distinctions 191 expression to meaning, and to this end break up our complex, intimately unified experience of the sense-filled expression, into the two factors of word and sense, the word comes before us as intrinsically indifferent, whereas the sense seems the thing aimed at by the verbal sign and meant by its means. The expression seems to direct interest away from itself towards its sense, and to point to the latter. But this pointing is not an indication in the sense previously discussed. The existence of the sign neither motivates the existence of the meaning, nor, properly expressed, our belief in the meaning's existence. What we are to use as an indication, must be perceived by us as existent. This holds also of expressions used in communication, but not for expressions used in soliloquy, where we are in general content with imagined rather than with actual words. In imagination a spoken or printed word floats before us, though in reality it has no existence. We should not, however, confuse imaginative presentations, and the image contents they rest on, with their imagined objects. The imagined verbal sound, or the imagined printed word, does not exist, only its imaginative presentation does so. The difference is the difference between imagined centaurs and the imagination of such beings. The word's non-existence neither disturbs nor interests us, since it leaves the word's expressive function unaffected. Where it does make a difference is where intimation is linked with meaning. Here thought must not be merely expressed as meaning, but must be communicated and intimated. We can only do the latter where we actually speak and hear. One of course speaks, in a certain sense, even in soliloquy, and it is certainly possible to think of oneself as speaking, and even as speaking to oneself, as, for example, when someone says to himself, "You have gone wrong, you can't go on like that." But in the genuine sense of communication, there is no speech in such cases, nor does one tell oneself anything, one merely conceives of oneself as speaking and communicating. In a monologue words can perform no function of indicating the existence of mental acts, since such indication would there be quite purposeless. For the acts in question are themselves experienced by us at that very moment. 9 phenomenological distinctions between the physical appearance of the expression, and the sense-giving and sense-fulfilling act. If we now turn from experiences specially concerned with intimation, and consider expressions in respect of distinctions that pertain to them equally whether they occur in dialogue or soliloquy, 2 things seem to be left over, the expressions themselves, and what they express as their meaning or sense. Several relations are, however, intertwined at this point, and talk about meaning, or about what is expressed, is correspondingly ambiguous. If we seek a foothold in pure description, the concrete phenomenon of the sensane-formed expression breaks up, on the one hand, into the physical phenomenon forming the physical side of the expression, and, on the other hand, into the acts which give it meaning and possibly also intuitive fullness, in which its relation to an expressed object is constituted. In virtue of such acts, the expression is more than a merely sounded word. It means something, and insofar as it means something, it relates to what is objective. This objective somewhat can either be actually present through accompanying intuitions, or may at least appear in representation, for example in a mental image, and where this happens the relation to an object is realized. Alternatively, this need not occur. The expression functions significantly, it remains more than mere sound of words, but it lacks any basic intuition that will give it its object. The relation of expression to object is now unrealized as being confined to a mere meaning intention. A name, for example, names its object whatever the circumstances, insofar as it means that object. But if the object is not intuitively before one, and so not before one as a named or meant object, mere meaning is all there is to it. If the originally empty meaning intention is now fulfilled, the relation to an object is realized, the naming becomes an actual, conscious relation between name and object named. Let us take our stand on this fundamental distinction between meaning intentions void of intuition and those which are intuitively fulfilled. If we leave aside the sensuous acts in which the expression, qua mere sound of words, makes its appearance, we shall have to distinguish between two acts or sets of acts. We shall, on the one hand, have acts essential to the expression if it is to be an expression at all, i.e. a verbal sound infused with sense. These acts we shall call the meaning-conferring acts or the meaning intentions. But we shall, on the other hand, have acts, not essential to the expression as such, which stand to it in the logically basic relation of fulfilling, confirming, illustrating it more or less adequately, and so actualizing its relation to its object. These acts, which become fused with the meaning-conferring acts in the unity of knowledge or fulfillment, we call the meaning-fulfilling acts. The brief or expression meaning fulfillment can only be used in cases where there is no risk of the ready confusion with the whole experience in which a meaning intention finds fulfillment in its correlated intuition. In the realized relation of the expression to its objective correlate for the sensane-formed expression becomes one with the act of meaning fulfillment. The sounded word is first made one with the meaning intention, and this in its turn is made one, as intentions in general are made one with their fulfillments, with its corresponding meaning fulfillment. The word expression is normally understood, wherever, that is, we do not speak of a mere expression, as the sense-animated expression. One should not, therefore, properly say, as one often does, that an expression expresses its meaning, its intention. One might more properly adopt the alternative way of speaking according to which the fulfilling act appears as the act expressed by the complete expression. We may, for example, say that a statement gives expression to an act of perceiving or imagining. We need not here point out that both meaning essential distinctions 193 conferring and meaning fulfilling acts have a part to play in intimation in the case of communicative discourse. The former in fact constitute the inmost core of intimation. To make them known to the hearer is the prime aim of our communicative intention, for only insofar as the hearer attributes them to the speaker will he understand the latter. I owe the phenomenological unity of these acts the above distinguished acts involving the expression's appearance, on the one hand, and the meaning intention and possible meaning fulfillment, on the other, do not constitute a mere aggregate of simultaneously given items in consciousness. They rather form an intimately fused unity of peculiar character. Everyone's personal experience bears witness to the differing weight of the two constituents, which reflects the asymmetry of the relation between an expression and the object which, through its meaning, it expresses or names. Both are lived through, the presentation of the word and the sense-giving act, but, while we experience the former, we do not live in such a presentation at all, but solely in enacting its sense, its meaning. And insofar as we do this, and yield ourselves to enacting the meaning intention and its further fulfillment, our whole interest centers upon the object intended in our intention, and named by its means. These two ways of speaking have in fact the same meaning. The function of a word, or rather of an intuitive word presentation, is to awaken a sense-conferring act in ourselves, to point to what is intended, or perhaps give an intuitive fulfillment in this act, and to guide our interest exclusively in this direction. Such pointing is not to be described as a mere objective fact of a regular diversion of interest from one thing to another. The fact that two presented objects A and B are so linked by some secret psychological coordination that the presentation of A regularly arouses the presentation of B, and that interest is thereby shifted from A to B, such a fact does not make the expression of the presentation of B. To be an expression is rather a descriptive aspect of the experienced unity of sign and thing signified. What is involved in the descriptive difference between the physical sign phenomenon and the meaning intention which makes it into an expression, becomes most clear when we turn our attention to the sign qua sign, for example to the printed word as such. If we do this, we have an external percept, or external intuitive idea, just like any other, whose object loses its verbal character. If this object again functions as a word, its presentation is wholly altered in character. The word, qua external singular, remains intuitively present, maintains its appearance, but we no longer intend it, it no longer properly is the object of our mental activity. Our interest, our intention, our thought, mere synonyms if taken in sufficiently wide senses, point exclusively to the thing meant in the sense-giving act. This means, phenomenologically speaking, that the intuitive presentation, in which the physical appearance of the world is constituted, undergoes an essential phenomenal modification when its object begins to count as an expression. While what constitutes the object's appearing remains unchanged, the intentional character of the experience alters. There is constituted, without need of a fulfilling or illustrative intuition, an ACT of meaning which finds support in the verbal presentation's intuitive content, but which differs in essence from the intuitive intention directed upon the word itself. With this act, the new acts or act complexes that we call fulfilling acts or act complexes are often peculiarly blended, acts whose object coincides with the object meant in the meaning, or named through this meaning. In our next chapter we shall have to conduct additional researches into the question as to whether the meaning intention, which on our view characteristically marks off an expression from empty sound of words consists in the mere association of mental imagery of the intended object with the sounded words, or at least necessarily involves such an act of fancy, or whether, on the other hand, mental imagery lies outside of the essence of an expression, and rather performs a fulfilling role, even if only of a partial, indirect or provisional character. In order not to blur the main outlines of our thought, we shall not here enter more deeply into phenomenological questions. In this whole investigation, we need only do as much phenomenology as is required to establish essential, primary distinctions. The provisional description so far given will have shown how complex is the correct description of a phenomenological situation. Such complexity appears inevitable once we clearly see that all objects and relations among objects only are what they are for us, through acts of thought essentially different from them, in which they become present to us, in which they stand before us as unitary items that we mean. Where not the phenomenological, but the naively objective interest dominates, where we live in intentional acts without reflecting upon them, all talk of course becomes plain sailing and clear and devoid of circumlocution iron. One then, in our case, simply speaks of expression and of what is expressed, of name and thing named, of the steering of attention from one to the other etc. But where the phenomenological interest dominates, we endure the hardship of having to describe phenomenological relationships which we may have experienced on countless occasions, but of which we were not normally conscious as objects, and we have also to do our describing with expressions framed to deal with objects whose appearance lies in the sphere of our normal interests. 11. The ideal distinctions between expression and meaning. As ideal unities, we have so far considered the well-understood expression as a concrete experience. Instead of considering its two types of factor, the expression's appearance and the sense-conferring or sense-fulfilling experience, we wish essential distinctions 195 to consider what is, in a certain fashion, given in these, the expression itself, its sense and its objective correlate. We turn therefore from the real relation of acts to the ideal relation of their objects or contents. A subjective treatment yields to one that is objective. The ideality of the relationship between expression and meaning is at once plain in regard to both its sides, inasmuch as, when we ask for the meaning of an expression, for example quadratic remainder, we are naturally not referring to the sound pattern uttered here and now, hide nunc, the vanishing noise that can never occur identically, we mean the expression in specie. Quadratic remainder is the same expression by whomsoever uttered. The same holds of talk about the expression's meaning, which naturally does not refer to some meaning-conferring experience. Every example shows that an essential distinction must here be drawn. If I sincerely say, we shall always presume sincerity, the three perpendiculars of a triangle intersect in a point, this is of course based on the fact that I judge so. If someone hears me and understands my assertion, he likewise knows this fact, he perceives me as someone who judges thus. But is the judging here intimated the meaning of my assertion, is it what my assertion asserts, and in that sense expresses? Plainly not. It would hardly occur to anyone, if asked as to the sense or meaning of my assertion, to revert to my judgment as an inner experience. Everyone would rather reply by saying, what this assertion asserts is the same whoever may assert it, and on whatever occasion or in whatever circumstances he may assert it, and what it asserts is precisely this, that the three perpendiculars of a triangle intersect in a point, no more and no less. One therefore repeats what is in essence the same assertion, and one repeats it because it is the one, uniquely adequate way of expressing the same thing, i.e. its meaning. In this self-same meaning, of whose identity we are conscious whenever we repeat the statement, nothing at all about judging or about one who judges is discoverable. We thought we were sure that a state of affairs held or obtained objectively, and what we were sure of we expressed by way of a declarative sentence. The state of affairs is what it is whether we assert that it obtains or not. It is intrinsically an item, a unity, which is capable of so obtaining or holding. But such an obtaining is what appeared before us, and we set it forth as it appeared before us, we said so the matter is. Naturally we could not have done this, we could not have made the assertion, if the matter had not so appeared before us, if, in other words, we had not so judged. This forms part of an assertion as a psychological fact, it is involved in its intimation. But only in such intimation, for while what is intimated consists in inner experiences, what we assert in the judgment involves nothing subjective. My act of judging is a transient experience, it arises and passes away. But what my assertion asserts, the content that the three perpendiculars of a triangle intersect in a point, neither arises nor passes away. It is an identity in the strict sense, one and the same geometrical truth. It is the same in the case of all assertions, even if what they assert is false and absurd. Even in such cases we distinguish their ideal content from the transient acts or affirming and asserting it, it is the meaning of the assertion, a unity in plurality. We continue to recognize its identity of intention in evident acts of reflection, we do not arbitrarily attribute it to our assertions, but discover it in them. If possibility or truth is lacking, an assertion's intention can only be carried out symbolically, it cannot derive any fullness from intuition or from the categorical functions performed on the latter, in which fullness its value for knowledge consists. It then lacks, as one says, a true, a genuine meaning. Later we shall look more closely into this distinction between intending and fulfilling meaning. To characterize the various acts in which the relevant ideal unities are constituted, and to throw light on the essence of their actual coincidence in knowledge, will call for difficult, comprehensive studies. It is plain, however, that each assertion, whether representing an exercise of knowledge or not, whether or not, i.e., it fulfills or can fulfill its intention in corresponding intuitions, and the formative acts involved in these, involves an intention, in which intention, as its unified specific character, its meaning is constituted. It is this ideal unity men have in mind when they say that the judgment is the meaning of the declarative sentence. Only the fundamental ambiguity of the word judgment at once tends to confuse the evidently grasped ideal unity with the real act of judging, to confuse what the assertion intimates with what it asserts. What we have here said of complete assertions readily applies also to actual or possible parts of assertions. If I judge if the sum of the angles in a triangle does not equal two right angles, the axiom of parallels does not hold, the hypothetical antecedent is no assertion, for I do not say that such an inequation holds. Nonetheless it says something, and what it says is once more quite different from what it intimates. What it says is not my mental act of hypothetical presumption, though I must of course have performed this in order to speak sincerely as I do. But it is rather the case that, this subjective act is intimated, something objective and ideal is brought to expression, the hypothesis whose conceptual content can appear as the same intentional unity in many possible thought experiences, and which evidently stands before us in its unity and identity in the objectively ideal treatment characteristic of all thinking. The same holds of the other parts of our statements, even of such as do not have the form of propositions. 12. Continuation. The expressed objectivity talk of what an expression expresses has, in the discussion so far, several essentially different meanings. It relates, on the one hand, to intimation in essential distinctions 197 general, and especially in that connection to sense-giving acts, at times also to sense-fulfilling acts, if these are present at all. In an assertion, for example, we express our judgment, we intimate it, but we also express percepts and other sense-fulfilling acts which illustrate our assertion's meaning. On the other hand, such talk relates to the contents of such acts, and primarily to the meanings, which are often enough said to be expressed. It is doubtful whether the examples analyzed, in our last section, would suffice even to lend provisional intelligibility to the notion of meaning, if one could not forthwith introduce a new sense of expression for purposes of comparison. The terms meaning, content, state of affairs and all similar terms harbor such powerful equivocations that our intention, even if expressed most carefully, still can promote misunderstanding. The third sense of being expressed, which we must now discuss, concerns the objective correlate meant by a meaning and expressed by its means. Each expression not merely says something, but says it of something, it not only has a meaning, but refers to certain objects. This relation sometimes holds in the plural for one and the same expression. But the object never coincides with the meaning. Both, of course, only pertain to an expression in virtue of the mental acts which give it sense. And, if we distinguish between content and object in respect of such presentations, one's distinction means the same as the distinction between what is meant or said, on the one hand, and what is spoken of, by means of the expression, on the other. The necessity of distinguishing between meaning, content, and object becomes clear when a comparison of examples shows us that several expressions may have the same meaning but different objects, and again that they may have different meanings but the same object. There is of course also the possibility of their differing in both respects and agreeing in both. The last occurs in the cases of synonymous expressions, for example the corresponding expressions in different languages which mean and name the same thing, London, Londres, Zwir, Deux, Duo etc. Names offer the plainest examples of the separation of meaning from the relation to objects, this relation being in their case usually spoken of as naming. Two names can differ in meaning but can name the same object, for example the victor at Jena, the vanquished at Waterloo, the equilateral triangle, the equiangular triangle. The meaning expressed in our pairs of names is plainly different, though the same object is meant in each case. The same applies to names whose indefiniteness gives them an extension. The expressions an equilateral triangle and an equiangular triangle have the same objective reference, the same range of possible application. It can happen, conversely, that two expressions have the same meaning but a different objective reference. The expression a horse has the same meaning in whatever context it occurs. But if on one occasion we say Bucephalus is a horse, and on another that cart horse is a horse, there has been a plain change in our sense-giving presentation in passing from the one statement to the other. The expression a horse employs the same meaning to present Bucephalus on one occasion and the cart horse on the other. It is thus with all general names, i.e. names with an extension. One is a name whose meaning never differs, but one should not, for that reason, identify the various ones which occur in a sum. They all mean the same, but they differ in objective reference. The case of proper names is different, whether they name individual or general objects. A word like Socrates can only name different things by meaning different things, i.e. by becoming equivocal. Wherever the word has one meaning, it also names one object. The same holds of expressions like the number 2, redness etc. We therefore distinguish equivocal names that have many meanings from general or class names that have many values. The same holds of other types of expression, though in their case talk of objective reference involves certain difficulties in virtue of its manifoldness. If we consider, for example, statements of the form cis p, we generally regard the subject of the statement as the object about which the statement is made. Another view is, however, possible, which treats the whole state of affairs which corresponds to the statement as an analog of the object and name names, and distinguishes this from the object's meaning. If this is done, one can quote as examples pairs of sentences such as A is bigger than B is smaller than A, which plainly say different things. They are not merely grammatically but also cogitatively different, i.e. different in meaning content. But they express the same state of affairs, the same matter is predicatively apprehended and asserted in two different ways. Whether we define talk of the object of a statement in one sense or the other, each has its own claims. Statements are in either case possible which differ in meaning while referring to the same object. 13. Connection between meaning and objective reference. Our examples entitle us to regard the distinction between an expression's meaning and its power to direct itself as a name to this or that objective correlate, and of course the distinction between meaning and object itself, as well established. It is clear for the rest that the sides to be distinguished in each expression are closely connected. An expression only refers to an objective correlate because it means something. It can be rightly said to signify or name the object through its meaning. An act of meaning is the determinate manner in which we refer to our object of the moment, though this mode of significant reference and the meaning itself can change while the objective reference remains fixed. A more profound phenomenological clarification of this relation can be reached only by research into the way expressions and their meaning intentions function in knowledge. This would show that talk about two essential distinctions, 199 distinguishable sides to each expression, should not be taken seriously, that the essence of an expression lies solely in its meaning. But the same intuition, as we shall show later, can offer fulfillment of different expressions. It can be categorially apprehended in varying ways and synthetically linked with other intuitions. Expressions and their meaning intentions do not take their measure, in contexts of thought and knowledge, from mere intuition, I mean phenomena of external or internal sensibility, but from the varying intellectual forms through which intuited objects first become intelligibly determined, mutually related objects. And so expressions, even when they function outside of knowledge, must, as symbolic intentions, point to categorially formed unities. Different meanings may therefore pertain to the same intuitions regarded in differing categorial fashion, and may therefore also pertain to the same object. But where a whole range of objects corresponds to a single meaning, this meaning's own essence must be indeterminate, it must permit a sphere of possible fulfillment. These indications may suffice for the moment. They must guard in advance against the error of seriously thinking that sense-giving acts have two distinct sides, one which gives them their meaning, while the other gives them their determinate direction to objects. 514 Content as object, content as fulfilling sense and content as sense or meaning. Simpliciter relational talk of intimation, meaning and object belongs essentially to every expression. Every expression intimates something, means something and names or otherwise designates something. In each case, talk of expression is equivocal. As said above, relation to an actually given objective correlate, which fulfills the meaning intention, is not essential to an expression. If this last important case is also taken into consideration, we note that there are two things that can be said to be expressed in the realized relation to the object. We have, on the one hand, the object itself, and the object as meant in this or that manner. On the other hand, and more properly, we have the object's ideal correlate in the acts of meaning fulfillment which constitute it, the fulfilling sense. Wherever the meaning intention is fulfilled in a corresponding intuition, i.e. wherever the expression actually serves to name a given object, there the object is constituted as one given in certain acts, and, to the extent that our expression really measures up to the intuitive data, as given in the same manner in which the expression means it. In this unity of coincidence between meaning and meaning fulfillment, the essence of the meaning fulfillment corresponds with, and is correlative, to the essence of meaning. The essence of the meaning fulfillment is the fulfilling sense of the expression, or, as one may also call it, the sense expressed by the expression. One says, for example, that a statement of perception expresses a perception, but also that it expresses the content of a perception. We distinguish, in a perceptual statement, as in every statement, between content and object. By the content we understand the self-identical meaning that the hearer can grasp even if he is not a percipient. We must draw the same distinction in the case of fulfilling acts, in the case, therefore, of perceptions and their categorial formations. Through these acts the objective correlate of our act of meaning stands before us intuitively as the very object we mean. We must, I say, distinguish again, in such fulfilling acts, between their content, the meaning element, as it were, in the categorially formed percept, and the object perceived. In the unity of fulfillment, the fulfilling content coincides with the intending content, so that, in our experience of this unity of coincidence, the object, at once intended and given, stands before us, not as two objects, but as one alone. The ideal conception of the act which confers meaning yields us the idea of the intending meaning, just as the ideal conception of the correlative essence of the act which fulfills meaning, yields the fulfilling meaning, likewise qua idea. This is the identical content which, in perception, pertains to the totality of possible acts of perception which intended the same object perceptually, and intend it actually as the same object. This content is therefore the ideal correlate of this single object, which may, for the rest, be completely imaginary. The manifold ambiguities in talk about what an expression expresses, or about an expressed content, may therefore be so ordered that one distinguishes between a content in a subjective, and a content in an objective sense. In the latter respect we must distinguish between the content as intending sense, or as sense, meaning simpliciter, the content as fulfilling sense, and the content as object. 15. The equivocations in talk of meaning and meaninglessness connected with these distinctions. The application of the terms meaning and sense, not merely to the content of the meaning intention inseparable from the expression, but also to the content of the meaning fulfillment, engenders a most unwelcome ambiguity. It is clear from previous indications, where we dealt with the fact of fulfillment, that the acts on either side, in which intending and fulfilling sense are constituted, need not be the same. What tempts us to transfer the same terms from intention to fulfillment, is the peculiar way in which the unity of fulfillment is a unity of identification or coincidence. The equivocation which one hoped a modifying adjective might render innocuous, can scarcely be avoided. We shall continue, of course, to understand by meaning simpliciter the meaning which, as the identical element in our intention, is essential to the expressions as such. Essential distinctions. 20. Meaning is further used by us as synonymous with sense. It is agreeable to have parallel, interchangeable terms in the case of this concept, particularly since the sense of the term meaning is itself to be investigated. A further consideration is our ingrained tendency to use the two words as synonymous, a circumstance which makes it seem rather a dubious step if their meanings are differentiated, and if, as Gieffrich has proposed, 6 we use one for meaning in our sense, and the other for the objects expressed. To this we may add that both terms are exposed to the same equivocations, which we distinguished above in connection with the term expression, and to many more besides, and that this is so both in scientific and in ordinary speech. Logical clarity is much impaired by the manner in which the sense or meaning of an expression is, often in the same thought sequence, now looked upon as the acts intimated by it, now as its ideal sense, now as the objective correlate that it expresses. Since fixed terminological landmarks are lacking, the concepts themselves run confusedly into one another. Fundamental confusions arise from these facts. General and equivocal names are, for example, repeatedly lumped together, since both can be predicatively referred to a plurality of objects. Lacking fixed concepts, men did not know how to distinguish the multiple senses of the equivocal names from the multiple values of the general ones. Here we also meet with the frequent unclearness as to the true essence of the difference between collective and general names. For, where collective meanings are fulfilled, we intuit a plurality of items, fulfillment is articulated into a plurality of individual intuitions, and so, if intention and fulfillment are not kept apart, it may well seem that the collective expression in question has many meanings. It is more important for us to set forth precisely the most detrimental equivocations in talk which concerns meaning and sense, on the one hand, or meaningless or senseless expressions, on the other. If we separate the blurred concepts, the following list emerges. 1. It is part of the notion of an expression to have a meaning. This precisely differentiates an expression from the other signs mentioned above. A meaningless expression is, therefore, properly speaking, no expression at all. It is at best something that claims or seems to be an expression, though, more closely considered, it is not one at all. Here belong articulate, word-like sound patterns such as abracadabra, and also combinations of genuine expressions to which no unified meaning corresponds, though their outer form seems to pretend to such a meaning, for example green is or. 2. In meaning, a relation to an object is constituted. To use an expression significantly, and to refer expressively to an object, to form a presentation of it, are one and the same. It makes no difference whether the object exists or is fictitious or even impossible. But if one gives a very rigorous interpretation to the proposition that an expression, insofar as it has meaning, relates to an object, i.e. in a sense which involves the existence of the object, then an expression has meaning when an object corresponding to it exists, and it is meaningless when no such object exists. Meanings are often spoken of as signifying the objects meant, a usage that can scarcely be maintained consistently, as it springs from a confusion with the genuine concept of meaning. 3. If the meaning is identified with the objective correlate of an expression, a name like Golden Mountain is meaningless. Here men generally distinguish objectlessness from meaninglessness. As opposed to this, men tend to use the word senseless of expressions infected with contradiction and obvious incompatibilities, for example round square, or to deny them meaning by some equivalent phrase. Sigwart 7, for example, says that a self-contradictory formula such as square circle expresses no concept we can think, but that it uses words to set up an insoluble task. The existential proposition there is no square circle, on his view denies the possibility of connecting a concept with these words, and by a concept he expressly wants us to understand, if we get him right, the general meaning of a word, which is just what we mean by it. Erdmann 8 has similar opinions in regard to the instance a square circle is frivolous. We should, in consistency, have to apply the word senseless, not merely to expressions immediately absurd, but to those whose absurdity is mediate, i.e. the countless expressions shown by mathematicians, in lengthy indirect demonstrations, to be objectless a priori. We should likewise have to deny that concepts like regular decahedron etc. are concepts at all. Marty raises the following objection to the thinkers just mentioned. If the words are senseless, how could we understand the question as to whether such things exist, so as to answer it negatively? Even to reject such an existence, we must, it is plain, somehow form a presentation of such contradictory material. 9. If such absurdities are called senseless, this can only mean that they have no rational sense. 10. These objections are clinching, insofar as these thinkers' statements suggest that they are confusing the true meaninglessness mentioned above under 1, with another quite different meaninglessness, i.e. the a priori impossibility of a fulfilling sense. An expression has meaning in this sense if a possible fulfillment, i.e. the possibility of a unified intuitive illustration, corresponds to its intention. This possibility is plainly meant ideally. It concerns no contingent acts of expression or fulfillment, but their ideal contents, meaning as an ideal unity, here to be called intending meaning, on the one hand, and fulfilling meaning, standing to it in a certain relation of precise adequacy, on the other. We apprehend this ideal relation by ideative abstraction based on an act of unified fulfillment. In the contrary case we apprehend the real impossibility of meaning fulfillment through an experience of the incompatibility of the partial meanings in the intended unity of fulfillment. The phenomenological clarification of these relationships calls for long, difficult analyses, as will appear in a later investigation. For if we ask what an expression means, we naturally recur to cases where it actually contributes to knowledge, or, what is the same, where its meaning essential distinctions 203 intention is intuitively fulfilled. In this manner the notional presentation, i.e. the meaning intention, gains clarity, it shows itself up as correct, as really capable of execution. The draft it makes on intuition is as it were cached. Since in the unity of fulfillment the act of intention coincides with the fulfilling act, and fuses with it in the most intimate fashion, if indeed there is any difference left over here at all, it readily seems as if the expression first got its meaning here, as if it drew meaning from the act of fulfillment. The tendency therefore arises to treat the fulfilling intuitions, categorially formative acts are here in general passed over, as meanings. But fulfillment is often imperfect, we shall have to devote closer study to all such possibilities, and expressions often go with remotely relevant, only partially illustrative intuitions, if with any at all. Since the phenomenological differences of these cases have not been closely considered, men have come to locate the significance of expressions, even of such as could make no claim to adequate fulfillment, in accompaniments of intuitive imagery. This naturally led to a total denial of meaning to absurd expressions. The new concept of meaning therefore originates in a confusion of meaning with fulfilling intuition. On this conception, an expression has meaning if and only if its intention, we should say its meaning intention, is in fact fulfilled, even if only in a partial, distant and improper manner. The understanding of the expression must be given life through certain ideas of meaning, it is commonly said, i.e. by certain illustrative images. The final refutation of highly attractive, opposed notions is an important task which requires lengthy discussions. These we shall postpone to the next chapter, and here go on enumerating different concepts of meaning. 16. Continuation, meaning and connotation. Another equivocation in our talk about meaninglessness was introduced by John Stuart Mill, and again rests on a new, fifth concept of meaning. He locates the essence of the meaning of names in their connotation, and therefore treats non-connotative names as meaningless. Sometimes he says, more carefully but less clearly, that they are meaningless in the proper or strict sense. It is well known that by connotative names Mill understands such as designate a subject and imply an attribute, by non-connotative names such as designate a subject without, as it is here more clearly put, indicating an attribute as attaching to it. 11. Proper names are non-connotative and so too are names of attributes, for example whiteness. Mill compares proper names to the distinctive chalk marks which the robber, in the well-known tale from the Arabian Nights, made on the house. 12. And he goes on to say, when we impose a proper name, we perform an operation in some degree analogous to what the robber intended in chalking the house. We put a mark, not indeed upon the object itself, but upon the idea of the object. A proper name is but an unmeaning mark which we connect in our minds with the idea of the object, in order that whenever the mark meets our eyes or occurs to our thoughts, we may think of that individual object. When we predicate of anything its proper name, when we say, pointing to a man, this is Brown or Smith, or pointing to a city, this is York, we do not, merely by so doing, convey to the reader any information about them, except that those are their names. It is otherwise when objects are spoken of by connotative names. When we say, the town is built of marble, we give the hearer what may be entirely new information, and this merely by the signification of the many-worded connotative name built of marble. Such names are not mere marks, but more, that is to say significant marks, and the connotation is what constitutes their significance. 13. If we set our own analyses alongside of these utterances of Mill's, we cannot help seeing that he confuses distinctions that should in principle be kept apart. Above all, he blurs the distinction between indicating and expressing. The chalk mark of the robber is a mere indication, while a proper name is an expression. Like every expression, a proper name functions as an indication, i.e. in its intimating role. Here there is a real analogy with the robber's chalk mark. If the robber sees the chalk mark he knows, this is the house I must rob. If I hear a proper name uttered, the corresponding presentation is aroused in me, and I know, this is the presentation the speaker is framing in his mind, and that he likewise wishes to arouse in mine. A name, however, has an additional expressiveness to which the intimating function is merely auxiliary. A man's presentation is not of primary importance, we are not concerned to direct interest to it but to the object it presents, to what it refers to and therefore names, and to set this before us as such. In a statement it makes its first appearance as the object about which something is asserted, in a wish sentence as the object about which something is wished, etc. Only in order to perform this task will a proper name, like any other name, become an element in complex, unified expressions, in statements, wish sentences and the like. But in its relation to its object the proper name is not an index. This is at once clear when we reflect on the fact that it is of the essence of an index to point to a fact, an existence, whereas the object named need not be taken to exist at all. When Mill, extending his analogy, holds a proper name to be associated with the idea of the person it names in essentially the same manner as the chalk mark is associated with the house, but at once adds that the point of the association is that we may think of the individual object whenever the sign meets our eye or enters our thought, his addition cracks the analogy wide asunder. Mill correctly stresses the difference between names that are a means towards knowing an object and names which are not, but neither this distinction, nor the equivalent distinction between connotative and non-connotative names, has anything to do with the distinction between the meaningful and the meaningless. The first mentioned pair of differences are in fact not merely essential distinctions 205 logically equivalent but identical. The difference is simply one of attributive and non-attributive names. To mediate the knowledge of a thing and to mediate its attributes mean exactly the same. It is, no doubt, important, whether a name means a thing directly or only by way of the attributes that pertain to it. But this is a difference within the unitary genus expression, just as a very important, parallel difference between nominal meanings, or logical presentations, which are attributive and those which are not attributive, is a difference within the unitary genus meaning. Mill after a fashion feels the difference in question by being at times obliged to speak of a meaning of proper names in a sense contrasting with the strict and proper sense ascribed to the meaning of connotative names. He would have done better had he introduced a wholly new sense of meaning, though not, we may say, one to be recommended. The way, at least, in which the distinguished logician brings in his valuable distinction between connotative and non-connotative names has done much to confuse the quite different distinctions we have here been discussing. One must note, further, that Mill's distinction between what a name denotes and what it connotes must not be confused with the merely cognate distinction between what a name names and what it means. This confusion is greatly aided by Mill's exposition. How important all these distinctions are, and how little it helps to treat them with superficial contempt as being merely grammatical, will be shown in further investigations. These will make plain, we hope, that if one blurs the straightforward distinctions we have proposed, we cannot hope for a trustworthy elaboration of the concepts of presentation and judgment, in the sense relevant to logic.